Hello and welcome. You're listening to the first episode of The Intimaphilian, and I'm your host, Miranda Barnes. This is a podcast about insects culture and why it's important to the latter that we protect the former. Thank you for tuning in. You're in for an interesting time. So, when you start a podcast, one of the things that you have to think about is what your theme music is going to be. Obviously, as a broke graduate student, I wanted to find something that was both royalty-free and insect-related, and in the process of looking, I found this cute little piano blurb for The Flight of the Bumblebee. I'm sure you've heard this one before. It does definitely have the energy of an insect buzzing frantically from place to place. But obviously, as the host of a podcast that purports to be about insects and culture, I couldn't possibly leave it at that. From whence then, dear listener, did Flight of the Bumblebee arise? If you're familiar with classical music, I'm sure that you already know that Flight of the Bumblebee was written by Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. What you might not know is that it's actually an interlude from an opera, The Tale of Tsar Saltan. So my first thought was, wow, an opera with a bumblebee in it. As an entomologist, a scientist who studies insects, and just general bug lover, I feel like I'm obligated to watch. But when you start looking around online for recordings of Tsar Saltan English subtitles, the pickings are kind of slim. Let's just say that The Flight of the Bumblebee has taken on quite the life of its own, pretty far removed from the show that spawned it. And I think there's really only one conclusion we can draw from this, and that is the reason why Tsar Saltan doesn't have a broad-reaching English audience is that it doesn't have enough bees in it. So I'm going to go through the general plot of Tsar Saltan, and, as an entomologist, suggest some bee-related themes that a bold opera director could use to draw new audiences to their production. If you stick around, maybe I'll even tell you what the heck is happening during the actual piece, Flight of the Bumblebee. Sorry to leave you hanging there. It's called building suspense. But before we start, I think we need to establish some important context on what a bumblebee is. Because I am an academic, my first temptation when it comes to answering that question is just to say insects in the order Hymenoptera, family Apidae, genus Bombus. It makes me feel so powerful when I say that. I wish that when we recited taxonomic nomenclature, it worked like some kind of incantation. Like I could recite that and just summon the bees to me. Tragically, that is not the case. And unless you're also an entomologist, that really doesn't give you all that much information except that there are a bunch of fancy Latin words that describe the groups that bumblebees belong to. But I'm sure most of you have at least seen a bumblebee before, particularly if you live in a temperate region of the world. They're big, they're fuzzy, they have some chalk to them. There are about 250 species of them. They carry pollen on their hind tibia in a little depression fringed with hairs. This is called a corbiculum. Obviously, insect legs are pretty different from people legs, but imagine it like carrying the groceries home on your shins. They're black and yellow, some of them have orange stripes. Unlike the carpenter bees, which have smooth butts, the abdomens of bumblebees are fuzzy. That's a way that you can tell them apart. And it's a scientific fact that they rank above skinnier, less fuzzy honeybees on a cuteness scale. I don't make the rules, sorry. Do you have an image in mind? If not, please look up pictures of bumblebees and come back to me. I will also be posting some bumblebee identification resources on the podcast website, so feel free to check there as well. Now that you have that image in mind, the tale of Tsar Saltan, of his son, the renowned and mighty bogatyr, Prince Gavidin Sultanovich, of the beautiful Swan Princess, yes, that is the full title, is based off of a fairy tale by Alexander Pushkin. It starts with three sisters weaving together with the village matchmaker, Barbarica. And because, it's a fairy tale, the two older sisters are mean and making their younger sister Militrissa work as they brag about what they would do as Tsarina. And then the younger sister says that if she were Tsarina, she would give the Tsar a child bogatyr, basically a knight or hero. I know it does have kind of like a bug sound at the beginning of it, at least my questionable pronunciation, but it is a real word, not bug related in Russian. Then of course again, because this is a fairy tale, the Tsar comes in at that very moment and he says he wants to marry the younger sister. I think we're actually off to a really strong start here in terms of emphasizing bee biology, because bumblebees are like honeybees in that they're what we call eusocial, One of the criteria for eusociality is reproductive division of labor. Basically, some members of the colony reproduce, and the rest do various other tasks to support that reproducing member's offspring. So, what we actually see happening here is that both the older sisters are probably worker offspring that emerged in the early summer, when all of the larvae in the bumblebee colony become female workers who look for food, take care of developing bees, and then defend the nest. And this younger sister, Militrissa, is probably a late summer fall baby that will develop into a queen bumblebee. Only the bumblebee queens reproduce, so it's really no wonder that she can make promises that the other sisters can't. She'll hole up for the winter after mating and then start a new colony in the spring. Though, of course, the grand irony of all of this is that if they were actually bumblebees, the workers could hypothetically lay eggs, but only male drone eggs, not future queens. You see, bumblebees and other Hymenoptera are what we call haplodiploid. Essentially, males only get one set of chromosomes, which are those structures where we keep all of our genetic information, and then females get two. When the queen mates with a drone, his sperm can fertilize her eggs, contributing his set of chromosomes to the mix and allowing for the production of female bees with two sets of chromosomes. An unmated worker wouldn't get this extra set. She would only be able to produce eggs with one set of chromosomes each, which would then all develop into males, or bogateers in this case. But fun fact, anyway. So, in the actual fairy tale, bees aside, the sisters are not very pleased that Militrissa was successful where they weren't, so they ask Barbarica for a way to destroy her. Barbarica tells them that once the Tsar goes to war, they can sneak a false message to him, claiming that Militrissa gave birth to a monster. So I think in etymology terms, what's happening here is that Barbarica is saying that they should pretend Militrissa is a cuckoo bumblebee in subgenus Bistheris. These bumblebees actually lost the ability to produce workers, and so they invade other bumblebee colonies and make their workers rear their brood for them. Anyway, they do this, and they're successful. The messenger returns with the letter from the Tsar, instructing them to throw Militrissa in a barrel with her son, and then cast it into the sea, which is pretty unfortunate for them, to be sure. But, fortunately for her, her son grows supernaturally quickly. Well, I say supernaturally quickly, but most worker bumblebees only live about a month, and queens only survive for the year, so actually maybe he's maturing at a very normal rate in bumblebee time. At any rate, their barrel winds up on what seems to be an abandoned island full of butterflies, to which Gvidin says, "Oh, you colored wings, as if painted with a brush. I don't like joking, I will catch you all at once." Clearly an entomologist born and bred. As he and his mom are figuring out what to do, they see a swan get attacked by a kite. Gvidin rescues it, and again, because this is a fairy tale, naturally the swan was actually a princess, and the kite was an evil sorcerer. So the next morning, they wake up to a beautiful city full of people who are super excited to be free from his influence, and they make Gvidin their new ruler. Again, since we're trying to add as many bee references into this opera as possible, I think that when we're designing the stage setup for this particular act, we should fill it with plants that bumblebees would appreciate. Now, if I were being really rigorous here, I should probably specifically look into Russian plants for Russian bumblebees, since this is a Russian opera. But I suspect that that is not going to be particularly useful for the vast majority of my listeners, so I'm instead going to assume we're doing a production where I'm based, Florida, and adjust my recommendations accordingly. The Circe Society actually maintains a list of plants that are particularly appealing to pollinators in different regions of the United States, and specifically marks the types of insects each plant should be able to support. So maybe we can think of the city being filled with the starry pink flowers of swamp milkweed, or orange flowers of butterfly milkweed. Maybe that would explain all the butterflies Gvidin sees flying around. Let's throw some frostweed in there too. That might actually be an apt plant given the setting, because in addition to providing these floral structures with beautiful white oblong florets surrounding these little white disc florets with kind of purplish anthers, the pollen-bearing organs coming out of them, it also expels water during frost that then freezes in these beautiful, almost cotton candy-looking whorls of ice. And just for good measure, let's fill the city with beautiful red trumpet-shaped flowers of scarlet sage, to blow the trumpets to herald the arrival of the bees. Despite the fact this is apparently a kind of paradise on Earth, Gvidin remarks as he sees a ship leaving harbor that he's sad and he wishes he could go see his dad Aww. Well, actually, admittedly, if my father had had my mom thrown into a barrel in the sea, I probably wouldn't be that eager to see him, but I guess Kvidin has not been on this earth for more than a few months at this point, so we'll forgive him for a little bit of naivete. The Swan Princess hears him talking about this, and she says that she can solve this problem by turning him into a bumblebee to fly over the sea. Oh my gosh, the bees are here. Now, I know I've been editorializing this whole time with bee trivia, but I promise I did not add this part in. This is actually what happens in the opera. Now, before I read the translated script, my first thought was, over the sea seems like a really long way to go for a bumblebee. I mean, forage distance for bumblebees is dependent on the species and the conditions in the environment, but it typically seems like they're foraging within a few hundred meters, I'm sorry, for the Americans in the audience, yards from their nests. In Europe, the buff-tailed bumblebee can easily travel 1.5 kilometers. Sorry, a little less than a mile, if there's good forage. A particularly motivated yellow-faced bumblebee on the west coast of the US can forage over 10 kilometers, 6 miles away from its home base. I don't know how big the sea we're talking about is, but to be totally honest, I don't think even 6 miles is going to cut it. But that doesn't matter, because it turns out what the princess actually intends for him to do is hide in a crevice on the ship. This I could totally believe, because we've definitely introduced non-native bumblebees to new countries across oceans before. She tells him the following. "Well, my bumblebee, go for a walk to join the ship at sea. Slowly descend, hide in a concealed crevice. Take care, Kvidin, fly. Just don't stay too long." And that's the flight of the bumblebee. That's right, we've reached the only part of this opera that everyone knows. Now, I'm sure you'll all be disappointed that in the original fairy tale, this actually happens 3 times, with Kvidin getting transformed into a mosquito, a fly, and then a bumblebee. Tragically, Rimsky-Korsakov did not choose to adapt all of these insects into his opera, but can you imagine, though, Flight of the Mosquito? We were robbed, I tell you. Maybe in our updated bee-centric adaptation, we'll add that part back in, and then the other fly, since mosquitoes are technically also flies, can be a hoverfly, since a lot of them mimic bees. Actually, if you're out and about and you see something that looks like a bee and you're not completely sure, if it lands on you, and you can clearly see it only has 1 pair of wings, it's a fly, not a bee. That does require you to, stand still and not freak out when it lands on you, which, is good practice even if it is a bee, but, entomology advice happening here. Okay, so Kvidin goes as a bumblebee to visit his dad. All the sailors are telling Tsar Sultan how awesome this island kingdom that Kvidin now rules is, with all of its bee-friendly forage. When Kvidin hears one of the sisters, the ones from earlier in the play that tricked the Tsar into ordering his son and wife thrown in a barrel, trying to convince the Tsar that the island is nothing special. So Kvidin stings her in the eyebrow. Now, I feel like it's worth mentioning at this particular juncture that male bees don't have stingers, because the stinger on female bees is a modification of the ovipositor, the structure that lets the insect lay its eggs. But if this is a world where people can be magically transformed into bumblebees, I feel like the Swan Princess was probably just being considerate, making sure that Kvidin can defend himself, so we'll let this one pass. Now, if Kvidin were a honeybee worker with that stinger, he would be dead, because those stingers are barbed and get stuck in the skin, so a honeybee essentially rips its abdomen apart trying to fly away. But fortunately, the Swan Princess had the foresight to turn him into a bumblebee, and bumblebees have smooth stings, so they can defend themselves multiple times. Like a true bogatir. And he does need to sting multiple times, because just after the cook sister gets done bad-mouthing the island, the weaver sister decides it's her turn. So obviously she also gets stung in the eyebrow. And then, right as the Tsar says that he absolutely has to go see the island, Barbarica, the woman who was talking to the sisters about how to trick the Tsar into getting rid of Kvidin and his mom, starts talking about the Swan Princess. Anyway, that's a step too far for Kvidin, so he stings her in the eye. And just so you know, the Tsar's reaction to this is to declare that all of the guards be hanged, and that all bumblebees are now forbidden from entering the royal court. Absolutely wild move. I'm so glad this man is apparently in charge of the entire country of Russia. I would really hate for the fate of my entire country to hinge on the decision-making capacity of someone so volatile. That aside, if you will permit me to pretend to take the side of the Tsar here for a moment, what do bumblebees even do for us anyway? Well, obviously, like other bees, bumblebees are pollinators. They play a vital role in plant reproduction, including a lot of plants that we as people enjoy eating. And maybe you're thinking as a listener, well, okay, sure, but all of the SARS honeybees can fill in for that work that the bumblebees were doing. But see, here's something that bumblebees have that honeybees don't. They can do this thing called buzz-pollination. Let me explain. On some plants, pollen is only released through these itty-bitty holes on the tips of those pollen-bearing anthers we discussed briefly earlier. If a honeybee is only brushing up against the anthers of these plants, they're not going to get that much pollen. There's not going to be that much pollination happening. But then, the humble bumblebee arrives. She lands on the flower, and she sort of folds herself over the anthers, gripping the base with her mandibles. She's sinking her teeth into that thing, holding on tight. Dog with a bone she's not letting go. And then she repurposes the muscles she would normally use to fly to vibrate. This has the effect of shaking all that pollen free and onto the bee. This benefits both the bumblebee, which can take some of that pollen back to its colony to feed the brood, and it benefits the plants, which have their pollen spread around to other flowers as the bee goes about collecting. And of course, it benefits us, because we get to enjoy food like tomatoes and potatoes. It really goes to show that just because people like the SAR don't understand why part of an established system is important, doesn't mean that it's not performing an important service. Maybe the SAR should have consulted people who were genuinely knowledgeable about the subject area before he and his court unilaterally decided to get rid of bumblebees. Regardless, this is all very silly on his part, because bumblebees don't really go out of their way to sting people. It's a defense mechanism for if they feel threatened, or if they feel their hive is threatened, or if they feel magical swan princesses are threatened. Just kidding. But just be careful handling flowers, or when hanging around little natural, or in some cases man-made cavities they might like to nest in. Back to the opera. So Gavinin goes home to his magical island and tells the swan princess he wants to get married. I don't know how old he is at this point. I think it's better not to ask these questions. Anyway, Gavinin is like, but wait, we can't get married until my father gets here. Which his mother immediately follows up by saying, God, bless them, live in wisdom and love. Because at this point it's clear to her that only a higher power could possibly save Gavinin from this massive blind spot about his dad. But the Tsar comes to the island, he's repentant, and Gavinin shows him all of the cool stuff there is to see, and then the Swan Princess reunites the Tsar with Militrissa. Again, because this is a fairy tale, and of course she does. They forgive the three sisters for lying, and they all live happily ever after, until the Swan Princess abandons her husband and all of her new in-laws to the long Siberian winter. Because if you remember from back at the beginning of this podcast, that's what happens with real bumblebee colonies. The drones, workers, and old queens die off, and it's only the new queens that remain to start a colony the following year. The end. So after all of that, I think the real question is, if Gavinin were trying to get to his dad today, could he do it? After all, it's a really hard time to be a bumblebee. Bumblebees as a group are on the decline. Some species have already gone extinct. In the United States, conservationists have only managed to get the rusty-patched bumblebee and the Franklin bumblebee listed under the Endangered Species Act, but there are many, many species that are under threat or experiencing population declines. And as we've already discussed, where bumblebees are threatened, plants that rely on buzz pollination are also threatened, meaning if we lose bumblebees, we probably also stand to lose a lot of the plant diversity that they support. But this is the audience participation component of this podcast, so I'm here to tell you that you can help if we didn't get home. Let's talk about what we can do to address the plight of the bumblebee. One major factor in bumblebee declines is habitat loss. As human populations get bigger, we need more space to live. We need more food and more non-food agricultural products, so farming and urbanization have gotten a lot more involved and expansive over time. The thing is, bumblebees need to eat too, and in spreading out into previously wild areas and intensifying our agricultural practices, we've destroyed a lot of the forage that bees depended upon to eat, and the safe cavities they once nested in. Some of the crops we grow can act as food sources for bumblebees, but a major problem is that most of these plants can't provide bumblebees with food for the whole season of activity. A field of wildflowers with different species blooming at different times of the year can support bumblebees from spring through summer. Fields full of a single crop may provide a lot of food for a short time frame, but when those crops are done blooming, those bumblebees are going to starve. So one of the major things we can do is preserve or create good habitat for bumblebees that keeps them fed for the whole season. When it comes to agricultural practices, farms can maintain wildflowers at field margins and rotate where their livestock graze over the course of the year, so that there are always at least some uneaten plants blooming for the bumblebees. If you have a yard, it is perhaps within your power to create the bee paradise I spoke of in our highly editorialized opera. I've put some resources up on the podcast website, linked in the show notes, if you want to create a region-appropriate version for the beans in your life. Maybe you start small. Making big landscaping changes can be challenging, but even if you're transitioning your community one pollinator-friendly native plant at a time, that's still one more plant that can feed a bee. And tell your city planners that these are the plants you want to see in park landscaping as well, because these green areas can be really important to bees living in more heavily urbanized regions. Another major problem bumblebees face is pesticide use. When we use insecticides to control for major pest insects on crops, in landscaping, and in home gardens, we also have the potential to harm other beneficial insects that use the same plants. Threats to pollinators are a major reason why the European Union and a few states in the US have taken actions to ban or restrict the use of neonicotinoid pesticides. But these aren't the only chemicals that can harm bee populations. Even herbicides like glyphosate have been shown to have negative effects on bumblebees. And it's difficult to do good risk assessments on some of these chemicals because most studies focus on honeybees. This is a problem because the biology of bumblebees can be quite different, and that can influence their vulnerability to pesticides in unpredictable ways. For example, if you're adjusting the timing of pesticide application based on studies of honeybee activity, you might inadvertently be harming pollinators that arrive at crops at different times. My guess is that most of the people listening to this podcast are not in a position to directly influence broad-scale agrochemical usage, but if you have a yard, you can reduce usage of these compounds in your own landscaping. I get it, when you get insect pests or weeds in your garden, they can be really persistent and annoying, and it's tempting to resort to pesticide usage as an easy way to try and keep them looking pretty, or that so you can eat homegrown garden produce at the end of the season. But remember that while you probably aren't depending on those plants for your next meal, bumblebees very well could be. And know that there are options for control that don't involve use of broad-spectrum insecticides. If you're in a position where you're struggling to manage insect pests in your home garden, I encourage you to check out some of the resources that your local university's extension services put out on how to implement responsible pest management strategies. I provided some links to the University of Florida publications in my description, just because that's where I'm based, but if you live in a different state, I encourage you to find information relevant to your particular area. Together, we can keep the world a little safer for all those bumblebee SARs and SARinas out there trying to reunite with their fathers, and possibly get revenge on their traitorous female relatives, but mostly the former. Thank you so much for listening to my voice for however long this episode ended up being. I hope you were entertained. I hope that you were filled with love for bees, and maybe opera, but mostly bees. If you want to support this podcast, feel free to leave a review and or share it with other people who you think might like it. Thank you. That's it. Goodbye.